Christy. Um, Welcome everyone and greetings from Stockholm, Sweden. As said, my name's Victoria Babbitt and I'm based in our Taylor and Francis Stockholm office. Today's session has been developed with input from our editors for researchers at the early stage of their career with little publishing experience. I'll provide an overview of the publishing process, focusing on how to prepare a manuscript, publishing ethics, and the peer review process. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat box, as said. We'll try and check this periodically through the talk. Otherwise, you may ask questions at the end. Also, please let me know if I'm speaking too quickly or if you don't understand something. Again, write that in the chat box so that we can, so that we're sure to see it. And lastly, just to let you know, I will share a PDF version of these slides after the talk. So let's get started. Before we get into the heart of the talk, I thought I would provide an overview of the publishing landscape today. There are approximately 10,000 publishers today, with 5,000 indexed in Scopus. Those publishers are publishing over 331 active, 33,000 active English language peer-reviewed journals, with a further 9,400 non-English language journals. This number traditionally grows by about 3.5% year on year. And those journals are publishing over 3 million articles per year, a number that traditionally grows by about 3% year on year. However, we've seen that the growth rates have been accelerating in recent years to 5% for new journals and 4% for articles publishing year on year. And this is mainly due to the increase in research and development spend on a national level globally. There's been a lot of investment into universities and the private sector for research. And this investment supports the work of between 7 to 8 million researchers, depending on how you define a researcher. But interestingly, only 20% are repeat authors. So many people are maybe just publishing something out of their dissertation or one article during their educational process and then going into the private sector, never publishing again. So as you can see, this is a very crowded landscape, and it's important that your work stands out, both in terms of the quality of research and the accessibility of the communication. To begin, here's a snapshot of the publishing process. We will discuss each of these stages in detail. What I'd like to point out here are the different versions of the article that you see on the bottom of the slide. It's important to understand the significance of each of these versions, especially if you're not publishing in an open access journal. The first version here is the author's original version, called mainly preprint these days. And this version, this is a version you submit for review. And this version you can post anywhere. So there's a lot of preprint servers out there now that you can use to post this version of your paper that has not gone through peer review. The second version is called the accepted manuscript or the postprint. And this is a version that has gone through peer review and been accepted for publication, but it has not gone to the production department. So it hasn't been typeset or copy edited or anything like that. This version, authors are able to post immediately on their personal website or shared via Facebook or LinkedIn. If the article is published in a subscription-based journal, the author must wait till after an embargo period to archive it in an institutional repository. If the journal is open access, the authors may post this version immediately to the archive. And lastly, we have the version of record. This is the final published version of the article, the PDF. And this version is maintained by the publisher and updated with relevant information. This version may not be posted on other sites unless, again, you've published in an open access journal. So before you begin investigating possible journal options, it's essential that you spend time understanding your project and the audience you would like to reach. Throughout your career, you're likely to be involved in many types of research, producing a variety of content. Typically, people focus on the research article, but can you turn off your microphone? Thanks. Typically, people focus on the research article, but you may publish review articles, literature. Somebody's got their mic on. There you go. Um, but you may publish review articles, whether they're theory or literature reviews or systematic reviews, position pieces, case studies, book reviews, et cetera, et cetera. Sometimes your work will be written for specialists in your field, but you also may choose to engage in public scholarship, so writing for the general public or policymakers. So make sure to take the time to determine your objectives. And when you begin investigating the appropriate place to publish, remember that you're joining an ongoing conversation in your field. Make sure you're contributing thoughtfully to that conversation. There are many different elements to take into consideration when choosing a journal, and I've listed a few here. So age, obviously a well-established journal with a good reputation is a safe bet. However, that doesn't mean you should ignore new or recently established journals. They may be publishing cutting-edge research and maybe using a new model that is interesting. Just make sure that you do research on the journal before submitting your article, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. It can be helpful to look at the history of the journal. Does it publish on time? Do they have a history of retractions or other problems? Are some of the key thinkers in your field publishing there? Affiliation may also be important, whether the journal is associated with an important society or a key publisher. The scope of the journal will certainly be important for different projects you're working on. Some journals are interdisciplinary journals. Some journals are very broad journals. So they're covering, every subdiscipline in your area. There's mega journals. And then there's very, niche journals that are focusing on a particular topic or area within the field. So it's just important to have a sense of what they're focusing on, which will be outlined in the aims and scope statement. The size of the journal might be important, and that has to do with how many issues they publish a year or how many articles they tend to publish a year. Again, the audience. Who reads the journals? Is it practitioners? Is it global audience? Impact, which can be measured in a number of ways. Most people look to the impact factor immediately, but there are also other important metrics within different communities. And in fact, it may be that it's an important teaching source for teaching material. Whatever the case is, you'll know best what's important in your subject area. And the editorial board will give an indication of what type of research the journal is interested in receiving. Boards are built to reflect the ambitions of the journal, so do take time to kind of review who is involved in the journal. Publishing model is becoming increasingly important. We're going to discuss open access in a moment, so I'll just leave that there. And peer review style may be important to you. We're going to talk about peer review as well. This information, again, will always be included in the journal website, either in the aims and scope statement or in the instructions for authors. Many journals publish their rejection rate, and this will give you an indication of how competitive a journal is. If a journal doesn't publish their rejection rate, you can use some of these other metrics listed here to get an indication of how competitive the journal would be. So if it's got an impact factor, a very high impact factor, obviously it's going to be a competitive journal. So it's just to do some due diligence, some research into the journal to get a sense of that. Sorry. In the last slide, I mentioned the aims and scope statement. All journals will have this, irrespective of the publisher. A statement of what the journal seeks to publish and who its main audience is. So who is reading the journal on a regular basis. Editorial boards spend weeks crafting their aims and scope statement. Their goal is to clearly explain what they're trying to achieve with the journal and the type of research they're interested in publishing. The aims and scope statements will often include key information about the peer review policy as well, as I mentioned before. Now, the process of submitting a paper and waiting to hear if the editorial board is interested in publishing it can be rather long. And increasingly, editors are having to reject papers without sending them out to peer review because they're inappropriate for the journal. They don't fit the goals or the scope of the journal. So you need to think about saving yourself and the editorial board's time and energy by carefully reading the aims and scope statement before submitting your article for consideration. And if you're unsure at all after you've done this research, you can try sending an abstract of your paper to the journal to see if they'd be interested. Now, not all editors answer these types of queries, especially if it's a really popular and competitive journal, but it's always worth a try. Right, as mentioned, the decision of where to publish is often influenced by what publishing model the journal uses. And increasingly, open access has become a requirement for funders and institutions, especially in parts of Europe. And many feel that this is a sensible path forward. There are two basic elements to open access. One is making content freely available. So that means anyone can read your article anywhere in the digital format. And the other one is about making content reusable. And I'm going to briefly explain both of these. So you remember those versions of the paper I mentioned earlier. Here's where we see their importance. Green OA is one of the types of OA, one of the ways in which you can make your work accessible. And essentially, it involves depositing the accepted version of the paper, the one that has not been sent to production, into an institutional or national repository. Often this occurs after an embargo period if the article isn't published in open access journal. So typically, embargo periods for arts and humanities and social sciences tend to be a little bit longer, about 18 months, than those for science and technology, which are around 12 months at Taylor and Francis, or medicine, which those can often be around 6 months. So you see that version right there in green, the accepted manuscript. The other version is gold open access, and gold open access essentially entails making the PDF freely available. It may involve an APC, which is an article publishing charge, which is usually covered by a funder or an institution. However, there are many journals that are supported by societies and either do not charge an APC or they may charge a lower subsidized APC. Most journals also have partial or full waivers for authors based in low to lower middle income countries. The most important thing is all of this should be clearly presented on the journal website under the instructions for authors. You shouldn't be surprised by an invoice later in the day if you've carefully read all the instructions for the journal. The other element to open access is how your work can be used after publication by others. If you publish open access, you'll be asked to choose a Creative Commons license, which describes how people can use your work in the future. Some journals do not give you a choice on which type of license you can use, so it's important that you investigate prior to submission if you have any concerns. So here are the licenses. The most typical one you'll find is called CC BY. This license allows authors to use your work in any way they choose as long as they clearly attribute the authorship, and original publication. The next one is CC BY-NC. And here an author can use your work in any manner, but they can't profit from it. For instance, they can't include your article in a book that they will subsequently charge money for. The next one, CC-BY-ND, means that an author cannot change your work in any way. They must use it in its original form. For instance, this would mean that they couldn't translate your work. So it has to be presented in that original form. And lastly, I wanted to include CC-BY-SA, which you may not run into too often, but it's important to keep this in mind. And this means that when people use your work, they need to attach the same license in any other iterations. So it's, as I said, not as common, but you should be aware of it, especially when you're using others' open access work. So with the rise of open access, we've seen an emergence of what are often called predatory publishers or journals. I can imagine that some of you have been contacted by these publishers who show enthusiastic interest in your work and ask you to submit to their journal. They often state that the peer review process is unrealistically short, days rather than weeks. The website might feature information that is incorrect or misleading, such as stating they have a global impact factor. Be aware, impact factors are called just that, never anything else. Here are some of the characteristics of predatory journals. They usually have hidden or unclear author fees. That's why I said you should be able to easily find all the information about article process, publishing fees or page charges or submission fees on a journal website. There's a lack of quality peer review of articles by experts in the field. And oftentimes there's a guarantee of acceptance and or the promise of very fast publication times. So within a week or 48 hours. If you want your research to be read and respected by others in your field, locally and internationally, it's important that you avoid publication in these fake journals. En masse, they erode the credibility of all research published in them. And once you've published an article in one of these journals, there's really nothing we can do because it usually has a DOI, so we can't retract it and publish it somewhere else. However, there are resources to help you make sound decisions about where you'd like to publish. For instance, a key resource is Think, Check, Submit, shown here on this slide. And this is a cross-industry initiative which aims to help researchers make informed choices and choose trusted journals to publish their research in. Think, Check, Submit can help you identify high-quality journals, which would be appropriate for submitting your research, and can protect you against fraud and publishing malpractice. But the best approach is to seek advice from respected colleagues. The DOAJ is a database for open access journals. That's this up in the upper right-hand corner there. The journals in this database have been screened to ensure they're legitimate journals. However, like many databases, there is an assessment period. So new journals that might be legitimate might not be listed immediately. In those cases, you need to make sure that they're published by a respected publisher. And here's where OWASPA, the last organization here in the bottom right-hand corner, can help. OWASPA is an organization for publishers and service providers working with open access. Members need to meet certain standards to be included. If the journal you're considering publishing in is not included in the DOAJ and the publisher is not a member of OWASPA, you should proceed with extreme caution. So again, you need to do even more research into the journal. Okay, so obviously today we're not going to be doing a writing workshop. I think it'd be pretty difficult to do with this many people and digitally, but I do have some simple guidance for you to consider when you're preparing your manuscript. First of all, think like an editor. Make it easy for them to read and enjoy your work. Depending on the size of a journal, editors can receive anywhere from 50 to well over 1,000 manuscripts a year. So make sure yours stands out. I've got a few different tips on how you can do that. You want to make sure that your argument is easy to read and understand. So what I would suggest is that you write first and edit later. This will help you create what's called a through line in your paper, the line that holds all of the different parts together, a narrative line, if you will. And simplicity is key, especially when you're dealing with complex problems and theories. Sentence structure can make a huge difference. Consider keeping your sentences relatively short. I've always worked with a 2.5 rule, and what that essentially means is no sentence should be longer than 2.5 lines. Now, the reason why I operate with this is because the reader oftentimes loses track of what the sentence is about if it goes on too long. They have to go back and say, oh, what was the subject of the sentence or whatever the case is. Now, it's not always possible to do this. Sometimes a sentence will include a list of topics that, extends it quite a bit. But what I would suggest is if you're needing to list something, that you might put those in parentheses. Again, just making it easier for the reader to understand the point you're making. Try to limit your use of passive voice sentence construction. So passive sentence construction is when a subject of the sentence is not clear. So oftentimes it will start with a verb. This is not always possible, of course, such as in a methods sections. You wouldn't write, I conducted a study. Rather, you would typically write a study was conducted. So the object is in the beginning of the sentence. If you're using passive sentence construction, just make sure to mix it up a bit to make it easier for the reader to follow your text. Um, Paragraphs should include their own mini thesis, i.e. what's being covered, or relate directly to what has come before. Keep them focused on one idea. If you're continuing discussion introduced in the previous paragraph, make sure to indicate that in some way. For example, a section might be making numerous points with each paragraph addressing one of the points, and that's easy to structure in a way that makes it possible for the reader to follow the points you're making. And create a clear and easy to follow structure for your paper. So here's the classic one here. Irrespective of discipline, most academic papers follow this model. It's especially important that you create a strong introduction, which is usually 2 to 3 pages long. You want an introduction that establishes the research question or problem you're exploring, provides a clear thesis or argument, which is easy to see and understand. Make sure that your argument stands out. Don't be shy. Don't bury it in the middle of a paragraph. You should also provide an outline for the structure of the paper, letting the readers know exactly what they can expect. And the outline typically is going to cover your methods or theory section, your results or findings, a discussion, and then finally a conclusion. So that's your basic structure there. Lastly, your role is that of a storyteller. It's up to you to give life to this exciting story of your research. So be brave and bold. However, your story should follow a logical path, not a chronological path. Once you've published, you of course would like people to be able to find and read your work. This begins with the basics, the first elements of your article that potential readers will see, the title and the abstract. Here we have a fairly non-controversial quote from one of our editors. The styles and formats of titles can vary somewhat depending on subject area, however, and individual writing style. However, there's some tricks to keep in mind when composing your title. First of all, write the title after you've written the paper, though it's not a bad idea to jot down ideas while you're writing. Include some of the essential terms in your paper in the title, and keep it short and to the point, so no more than 16 words or fewer. Avoid jargon and abbreviations at all times, and never include a period at the end. Your title's not a sentence, it's just a title. For those using qualitative methods where the temptation is to use a quote in the title, make sure that you have a subtitle that's providing some context to that title so that people understand what the actual article is about. So why are abstracts important? Actually, I really appreciate this very frank quote from one of our editors. Abstracts should tell the reader what the article is about. So they're like little film trailers for your article. They should give a sense of what the story is about without providing all of the details. So more like a French film trailer rather than an American film trailer where you never need to go see the movie. And here are some basic tips on how to construct an abstract. It's difficult to write a decent abstract before you actually finish the paper, as the abstract is an overview of the content. Make sure that you know the parameters for the particular journal you're submitting to. Most have word counts and perhaps some guidance on how they want those abstracts structured. Think about who your potential audience is again and write it for them. So if you're writing for practitioners, you might use different language than if you were writing for people that are deeply involved in the same research you are. And choose the language carefully. Think about keywords and how someone might search for your work. And think interdisciplinary in terms of the language as well, especially if your work is interdisciplinary in nature. Once you've done kind of the first write through, go back and remove any unnecessary words. Focus on the essential information. And if you do end up revising your paper, which you will through the peer review process, make sure to go back and review the abstract because you might need to revise it as well. It should match what is going on in the paper. Make sure to read it out loud and have others read it for fluency. If your abstract is difficult to read, it's unlikely that people will click through and read the article because they'll anticipate that the article is going to be poorly written. Along with the title and abstracts, authors are often asked to provide keywords that will be included with the metadata for the article. And these keywords, which I've mentioned in both the title and the abstract, act as little flags in searches to help readers find your work. Make sure to identify the words or phrases that would be effective in searching for your work. And do use synonyms, as people might use slightly different words. And again, especially if your work is interdisciplinary, different disciplines use different language to talk about phenomena. When using words and phrases, be specific and narrow down the search results. Think about using qualifiers as I have with this example here. So if I put in homelessness in a search, I'll get all sorts of services, local services for the homeless population in Stockholm. But if I were to put Swedish homelessness policy, I'll probably get more white papers, government agencies, and this sort of thing, and probably some academic papers. So it's just, play around with it and see what kind of results you get when you do put in your keywords and key phrases. The main thing is just to test this and see what your results are. So instructions for authors, I mentioned this a couple times. This is the journal rule book. It's so important that you read this thoroughly and make sure that you followed all the requirements for the journal. The type of information that will be included is the type of peer review, word limits, formatting requirements, the copyright policy, open access policies, if they've got data requirements or policies, any kind of fees that might be required, so submission fees, page charges, or if you're publishing open access, all that information will be there as well. Your paper must adopt all the requirements. Otherwise, it's likely to be returned to you for reformatting rather than being sent out for peer review. So, issues around publishing ethics are seemingly on the rise, or it's possible that we're just getting better at identifying breaches. And here are some of the issues that we see on a regular basis. So authorship issues, competing interests, duplicate submissions or publication, data or image fabrication or falsification, plagiarism or text recycling, peer review manipulation, and breaches of copyright. We could easily have a full session on publication ethics today, but I'm just going to focus on 3 of the most common issues that we tend to deal with across disciplines, and that's authorship, duplicate submission and publication, and plagiarism and text recycling. So for authorship, authorship issues are quite common, and the main thing to remember is they tend to slow down the peer review and production processes. Once the issues often the issues have to do with disagreements over who is included on the author line, the sequence of names, and who's responsible for different parts of the process. So it's extremely important that you have a written agreement between all of your co-authors regarding the responsibilities and the sequence of names on the authorship line. If we are alerted to any problems with this, we just tend to stop the process and ask the authors or sometimes the institution to deal with the problem and come back to us after they've resolved it. So it's in your interest to have this sorted out before you ever submit your paper. There's 3 distinct kind of phenomena with authorship issues that I would like to address today. The first one is ghost, and this has to do when with when there's a significant contribution to a manuscript without acknowledgement of the author of that contribution. And this is an issue because we can't know if there's a conflict of interest. So if somebody has contributed to the research and communication of the research findings, and we don't know who that person is, we can't go back to see if they're a part of the industry or if, as I say, they have competing interests in any way. The next one is guest authorship, and this is when authorship is granted to an individual who does not meet the ethical standards of authorship because of his or her seniority or their reputation or their supposed influence. This is common in some institutions, but anyone on the authorship line should have made a significant contribution to the paper as they're going to be held responsible for it in the future. And the last one is authorship for sale. This one surprised me when I first heard about it, but there have been a number of cases where predatory publishers or paper mills offer to add authors' names after a paper has been accepted for publication for a price. So, $1,000, you can have your name added to an authorship line. And of course, in this era of publisher perish, where researchers are being asked to publish more and more every year, these types of solutions can be quite attractive for people when they don't have enough time to write up their findings. The most important thing to remember is any listed author is a representative of the published paper and should have in-depth knowledge about all aspects of the study as published, i.e. the rationale, the methodology, the analysis, and the interpretation. So this is something, as I say, publishers are very aware of and monitoring and intervening in many cases on. Duplicate submission. This rule is a rule that many early career researchers are surprised by, I find. I know I was the first time I heard about it. Um, why is it a problem to submit to more than one journal at a time? Well, when you submit your paper to a journal for review, you're committing to publishing in that journal, and you're oftentimes asked to acknowledge that you're only submitting to that one journal. So you've entered an agreement with the journal. And why this is important is they will use their time and resources to review your paper and help you improve it. So they're really investing in you and your paper. You can only publish a paper once, so there can only be one version of record. The thing to remember about duplicate submissions is it's really easy to detect. Oftentimes, the papers are sent to the same reviewers who then alert editors or other publishers that they're reviewing two versions of the same paper for two different journals. And this can often happen because there wasn't a clear agreement on roles and responsibilities between the authors. Hence, two of the co-authors accidentally submitted the paper to two different journals. But editors are becoming less forgiving about this and will withdraw the paper oftentimes in question from peer review. We try and treat these processes as educational processes. We usually contact the author first and ask them for clarification on what's happened. But because this is happening so often now, editors are becoming a little bit more strict. Now, sometimes it is okay to submit work that has been presented elsewhere. You just need to be honest with the editor about previous presentations or publications or postings. Transparency is key to all of these processes. So for instance, if you've published an article in, say, another language, but you would like to publish it in English, contact the editor of the journal and ask them if they would be interested in publishing a translation. They may be very happy to do so. They may not, but they may be able to point you in the right direction to another journal that would be interested in it. Similarly, with data presented at a conference, it's not unusual to publish an article that's based on content presented at a conference. Just make sure to clearly state that the data or an earlier version of the paper was presented at the conference. Now, preprint servers no longer are an issue for most journals. Again, cite the original publication in your paper and let the editor know that it can be found in a preprint server, and provide the link to that. And lastly, originality issues are also becoming easier to detect. Most journals use software to measure incidences of overlap with previously published work. Most of you know that if you use someone else's ideas, processes, or words, you need to clearly cite them in the paper and provide full reference to their work. This is true of all content, including websites, blogs, etc. What many are less aware of is that they need to cite their own published work if you've used it in your paper, because this will show up in an originality check. So if you're working with ideas that you've worked with before in another paper, make sure that you reference that earlier paper. However, we're seeing a rise of text recycling, which is often called salami slicing. This is when you use the same ideas, data, words excessively to the point that it's not offering any new insights or contributing anything new to the literature or the field. So a typical example of this would be that you have a research project you've worked with that should actually lead to maybe 2 published articles, but you try and squeeze 3 or 4 articles out of that data. So the third and fourth article aren't really adding anything new to the body of literature. Anything you publish should be original content and should be pushing the field forward in some way. All right, so a little bit about some things that you should consider before you submit your journal for peer review. It's a good idea to review what's already been published in the journal that you've chosen. You might find work that's relevant to your own that you feel that you should cite. Again, you're joining a conversation, but don't cite work that isn't relevant just to get on the good graces of the editor. It should actually be helping your article in some way. Uh, Make sure that your work matches the aims and scope of the journal, as said previously. Editors spend a good amount of time crafting these statements, and you don't want to delay the process by submitting to the wrong journal. Review your bibliography before submitting, and make sure you've included everything, citations to everything that is referenced in the article, and remove references that are no longer in the current draft. And again, make sure to take another look at the aims and the instructions for authors to make sure that everything is formatted correctly. And just a quick word about language. I get this question a lot, irrespective of where I am in the world. And when I ask editors about this, most editors say they're happy to look at a paper as long as they can understand the arguments and methods. The language doesn't have to be perfect. However, it needs to be understandable. Um, if possible, try and have a native English speaker, somebody who is uh, very advanced in their English capabilities, read your paper for fluency. But do remember that not all native English speakers are equal. Some may have a better understanding of grammatical conventions and a broader vocabulary, or an understanding of the particular language used in your subject area. If your paper is understandable, wait to hear back from the editors and reviewers. They'll let you know if the paper needs further language editing. Now, if you find that you need to send it out to language editing before you submit, there are plenty of services out there, and many publishers like Taylor and Francis have editing services. So just check the website. Even journals sometimes have editing services. Here are some basic tips to keep in mind prior to submitting. First of all, in most cases, you'll be submitting to an online system, so make sure that you have all the files on hand that you need to submit. If you're using images or data that are not yours, make sure that you've obtained permission. That's your responsibility, not the publisher's. And if you are having difficulty obtaining permission, say you are using a photo that you can't contact the photographer, or there was a case I had a few years ago for a geography journal where someone had used a tourist map from the 1970s, and they tried to contact the publisher that was out of business, and they tried to find the cartographer. They couldn't locate the person. And the main thing is you just need to keep a paper trail. So you need to show that you have done due diligence. You've sent the emails. You've tried everything to contact these people. and include that with your submission when it gets time for production, because then if we're asked about this, we will have the documentation to show that you tried your very best to obtain permission. As I mentioned before, make sure you have an agreed upon plan with your co-authors so that you have their correct information, include their preferred spelling of their name. And lastly, make sure the version you submit is the final version and not an earlier draft. This happens now and again. So when you're pulling together all those files, getting ready to submit, make sure that those are all the most recent files, the files that you actually want to submit. Right, so here's an overview of how peer review works in most cases. Your manuscript is submitted to the journal and goes through a check to see if everything's in order. If it's not formatted correctly or it's missing files or other components, it will be returned to you with instructions to reformat, update, or include more material. This isn't a rejection, it's just saying that we need more material. We need it to be reformatted. Once the files are in order, the submission is sent to the editor for a quick review. So the editor will decide if the paper should be sent out for peer review at this stage. So though, as I said, they're going to be looking at that introduction. So it's really important that you make your case in that introduction and you really are clear about what the paper includes and how the argument is going to be developed. At this stage, it can be rejected if it's out of scope of the journal, if it's not complete, if it's unreadable or not understandable. And this is called a desk reject. So that first red box there. Now, if the paper is of interest, the editor will send it out for peer review, usually to 2 or more external reviewers who are specialists in the field. They'll read the work and provide a report to the editor with a recommendation for a decision. And the most common recommendations are revise and resubmit, either with major revisions or with minor revisions. Now, this means they're interested in your work, but they have some suggestions on how you can make it even better. Your paper can also be rejected at this point. Now, I've included accept and starred it here. It is possible that your paper will be accepted without revisions, but it's highly unlikely. And I usually like to tell the story of Eugene Fama, who won the Nobel Prize a few years ago. And I went to see his lectures. And to be honest with you, I couldn't follow most of it. It was very advanced mathematics. But at one point, he's presenting one of the papers that led him to win the Nobel Prize. And he stops and he kind of leans back and goes, huh, that's the only paper that was accepted without revisions. And he was in his mid 70s. So the fact is you're more often going to be asked to make revisions. And again, it's just a question of trying to improve your work. And every piece of writing can be improved upon. Once you make the revisions, you'll resubmit to the editor, who will either accept it right away or send it out again to the reviewers to see if they're happy or if they have further comments. Now, here's the bad news. Your paper can go through this process a couple of times and still be rejected. I'll tell you how to avoid that in just a moment. Just a quick word on the 3 types of peer review, and there's many variations within this, but just basically, I thought I would note this. Single blind peer review is when the identity of the peer reviewer is hidden. Double blind is where both identities are hidden. And then open peer review is where all of the identities are known. So everyone knows that the author knows who the peer reviewers are and vice versa. Now, I should note that with the open science and open research movement, we're seeing even more innovations in how peer review is organized. So, you know, again, it's really important that you do read those instructions for authors and understand what the peer review process entails. So I mentioned that your paper can go through the peer review cycle a couple of times and still be rejected. But here are some tips to help you avoid that outcome. First of all, don't become disheartened, especially if you get a revise and resubmit with major revisions. It can feel a little bit like a rejection letter. I speak from experience. But you know, if you're finding that you're really upset when you get that, just shut down your computer for a couple days, 24 hours or whatever, and just forget about it. Get some distance from it. And then when you're ready to get down to business, open up the computer and carefully read the decision letter from the editor. Sometimes they'll provide some guidance on how to deal with the reviewer comments, and they'll often tell you how long you have before you need to resubmit your um, revisions. If you have co-authors, set up a meeting to go over the comments from the reviewers. And I would recommend breaking down the comments by category. So create a to-do list based on the comments that you've received from the reviewers. Um, and, discuss as a group and make all the suggested amendments if appropriate. And remember, if a peer reviewer has misunderstood something, take some time to review your explanation because it might actually be your fault. You might not have explained it as clearly as you thought you had. So take some time to rewrite that, have a few people read it, have people outside of your discipline read it just to make sure that it is clear. Address every comment. So as I said, create a list of the suggestions that the peer reviewers have made, and that can be your document that you're sending back to the editor with your revised paper. Where you've amended, note what you've done. If you've added new material or changed something, be specific with page numbers so it's easy for them to locate. And if you chose not to adopt one of the suggestions, which will happen, you need to be specific about why. Why didn't you do it? And give that explanation. It could be that they wanted you to cite somebody, but that was taking your paper in a different direction. They might have wanted you to do something with the data that you disagree with. Just be really specific about why you didn't incorporate those suggestions. And again, be respectful in your reply there. Prior to sending off your response to the editor, make sure it's clear and devoid of any frustration, because sometimes, again, the process can be a bit emotional. So you want to make sure that it is a professional letter. And remember, the reviewers are trying to help you publish your very best work, and they're oftentimes doing it on their free time. So do be respectful in how you're interacting with them during this process. So, in the case your paper was rejected, I've included an image here of Stanley Bradley's, of Solomon Barrison's rejection letter. This is from the 1950s. He subsequently won the Nobel Prize based on this work. So, oftentimes some of the cutting edge work is rejected, happens to the best of us. But if your article is rejected, first of all, again, close your paper, have a cup of tea, forget about the paper for a couple days. You can apply the same strategy as I mentioned in the previous slide, make a list of comments and begin editing the paper for the next submission. However, the rejection might be due to the fact that it wasn't the appropriate journal for your paper. So you do need to take some time to assess that. Now, when you're looking at journals at the beginning and trying to identify what journals are the best journals, I would recommend that you create a list for yourself of the journals that you'd like to publish in, your target journals. And obviously you've submitted to the journal on the top of your list, but if that journal rejected your paper, it's just to move to the next journal on your list. And again, remember to treat it as an entirely new submission. So you need to reformat the paper and that sort of thing. And here are some of the typical reasons for rejection. So the first one here is sent to the wrong journal. So again, remember to carefully read the aims and scope of the journal and look at what's been published before. Understand what sort of writing project you're undertaking and research the best platform for your work. The biggest challenge oftentimes is turning a larger project into a smaller article. It requires a lot of confidence and often painful editing. Review and follow the instructions for authors. This kind of information will just be there. They'll tell you exactly what kind of word count you need. And for these ones, it's quite a few. This has a lot to do with sharing your work with trusted colleagues and having them read and comment. And what I would say is try and have colleagues who are critical look at your work. You don't want people who are going to say, oh, this looks great, no problem. Yeah, it looks great. You want somebody who's got a red pen and who's going to tear your paper apart to help you make it better. And when I was in grad school, we actually had a group that would meet once a month. And it was an interdisciplinary group with people at different stages of their career, so tenured professors to PhD students, and one person would share their work each month. And it was really, really helpful. Number one, to get a variety of feedback on the papers we were working on, but also to demystify the process. It helps you to see that everyone actually struggles with the writing process and needs support and needs feedback. So if you have the possibility to create a writing group or a feedback group, I highly, highly encourage you to do so. And then the last one, I think it goes without saying, avoid this at all costs. Presenting libelous, unethical, um, or rude content. Now, what do you do when your article is accepted? Well, obviously you celebrate, you've earned it. While getting published is a great accomplishment, no matter what stage you are in your career, it's especially so the first time. Make sure that you keep all those versions of your paper that I mentioned before. You never know how you're going to need to use them in the future. Publishers do their best to try and move manuscripts through the production process as quickly as possible, but much depends on the author. So be sure to return the proofs by the suggested deadline and answer any queries the production editor has as quickly as possible. And most importantly, don't hesitate to ask questions. That's what we're here for. So if you don't understand a part of the process, just make sure to ping a note to the production editor and they'll help you with that. And here are some simple but effective ways of drawing attention to your work once you have published. The first one is using your email signature. You can easily use your email signature to tell everyone you've just been published, just adding a line of text and a link to the article. So one of the editors I work with has under his signature just a line saying recent publications, and then he has the direct links to those publications. I mean, oftentimes they will be writing to people that will be interested in their work, so it's a perfect way of signaling that you've got new publications. If you have a profile page on your institution's website or a personal website for projects that you're involved with, please include a link to your article. The more links to your article from a range of websites, the higher your article will appear in search engine results. So for instance, on Google Scholar. It's also a good idea to point your students in the direction of your work if appropriate. If you're on any networking sites or discussion lists, do make the most of those. Post a short message to any listserv that you're a member of, letting them know that the journal's latest issue, which includes your article, is now available. You can also share the table of contents alerts for the journal so they can see that. And obviously use your social media sites as much as you can. I've got one of my friends is really great on Facebook. Every time he publishes something, he'll just say, for those of you who might be interested, and he puts a link. And oftentimes LinkedIn is a really good site for sharing work as well. That's all I have. I'd be happy to take questions now, or if you'd like, you can always contact me on the address on this slide. I'm happy to have a follow-up conversation via email.
Thank you, Victoria. So if anyone has any questions, kindly type them in the chat box. We will get to them one by one. Okay, maybe to start the ball rolling, I think we can just maybe talk about a few questions we've gotten from previous sessions, and if you feel you have any follow-up questions to those, feel free to type them in the chat box. So one of the questions we get is regarding peer review. So, what should I do when I receive conflicting advice from peer reviewers?
Thanks, Christy. Yeah, this can be a common problem for people where one peer reviewer is suggesting one line of action, the other one is suggesting something in conflict with that. So two different opposing suggestions. And oftentimes the editor, as I said in that editor response letter, when they're sending you the feedback, oftentimes they'll address that. They'll say, okay, peer reviewer one has suggested this, peer reviewer two has suggested this. I would recommend peer reviewers one's strategy or whatever the case is. Um, if that hasn't occurred, if you're just left with these conflicting suggestions, you can always go back to the editor and say, I've been directed to go two ways. What's your preference? And they usually will give you feedback on that.
Okay, thanks, Victoria. Okay, we're waiting for questions. Okay, there's one. Okay, so this is regarding manuscripts. I have an interdisciplinary manuscript, but I keep getting desk rejected because most of the journals in TNF are focused on specific fields. Could you maybe share which specific field this you're referring to? Claire, I think, the one who has shared this question. Okay, so the specific field that Claire was referring to was participatory action research and ethnography.
Okay. So are you doing methods work, focusing in on methods work?
Yeah, I'm actually using the action research, um, but using ethnography for my findings.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, I'm trying to promote participatory action research among a community of musicians, but using action research and ethnography for my findings.
It sounds like really great research. You know what? We have plenty of interdisciplinary journals. I think what might be best is why don't you send me an abstract of your work,
Mhm.
and I'll contact the editorial director and see if they have some suggestions of journals that might be appropriate.
Okay, yeah, that sounds great. I'll do
Yeah.
that. Thank
Okay. Great. But just in general, a general comment on interdisciplinary research, most journals do try and indicate in the aims and scope if they're interested in that kind of research. And as I say, otherwise you can kind of look at the content that's been published in the last year to see if you see some instances of interdisciplinary work um, in the journal. That's the best way to do it if you're just going blind and you don't have a resource like me to use.
Okay, Claire, hope that helps with your question. The next question that we have is regarding differences between Scopus and ISI impact journals.
Okay, so what you're talking about there is just a difference. I think somebody's got their mic on somewhere. What you're talking about there is a difference between two different databases, basically. They have different criteria for indexing journals, slightly. And then, of course, their metrics are slightly different. So with Scopus, they have a 3-year window, whereas with the ISI, they have a 2-year window. Traditionally, the Web of Science was much more competitive than Scopus. When Scopus first started, they let in, they brought in a lot of journals, but Scopus has become much more competitive over time. I would say, as a general rule, people look to the impact factor more than they look to the Scopus metrics as a measure of quality. For better or worse, there's a lot of, discussion about whether these types of metrics are actually helpful in terms of measuring quality. Um, but in terms of assessing journals based on whether they're in Scopus or whether they're in the ISI or the Web of Science, it's going to be based on. What I would say is it's based on what's important in your subject area. You should have a sense of what journals are important in your subject area because both of those metrics might not really mean anything. But as I say, I think that there's more weight, for better or worse, given internationally to the Web of Science at this point in time, although I do realize that Scopus is very important in a lot of communities and for a lot of institutions. Sorry, I don't know if that was a helpful answer or not, but it's a difficult question to give a straight answer to.
Okay, thanks, Victoria. The other question we have is details on making your accepted manuscript into preprints. Sorry.
Oh, so going the opposite direction? Well, the preprint. uh, Actually, I don't know if I'm understanding that question.
Okay, could I get, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing the name properly, but Abdul Wakil, could you maybe give more detail on that question? We can attend to that in a while then. Another question in the meantime that we have is what is the best website to obtain shared latex templates?
I can honestly say I don't know. Can you send me that question and I'll forward it on to one of my colleagues?
Okay, I will
Yeah,
do that. Sure, sure.
yeah, yeah. No, but if the author can send me that question, because then I can respond directly to the author. So just again, use that email there, and I'll try and get back to you in 24 hours with some suggestions.
Okay, sure. Sounds good. Mm, Another question we have is regarding the publishing process on how long can one recorrect his manuscript and send it back to the same journal if it was rejected and advised. So I think we get this question a lot about the timing. Is there something else you'd like to
Yeah.
add? Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard. People want to know how long peer review takes, and peer review is a human process. And as you saw when I took you through that chart, you can go through a few revision processes. Um, so what I like to say about peer review, we usually try and tell our journals that a first decision should be delivered within 3 months. At the longest. I mean, obviously, a lot of journals are much quicker than that, but it's not always possible because they're asking people to contribute their time to assess the papers, and people are busy. But we do try and, at least that first decision, we try and encourage a first decision within 3 months. Now, beyond that, it has to do with the author, how quick they are to return their revisions. And then again, how quick the editorial team is. Sometimes, as I said, the editor will look at the revisions, and it helps if you do have that list where you're being very specific about what you've done and what you haven't done and why, because then they can look at it and go, oh, okay, I see this, and maybe then they can make a decision and they don't need to send it back out to the peer reviewers again. So that helps speed up the process when you do things like that. But it's impossible to give you an exact timing on how long it takes.
Sure, I think that was pretty well summed up based on past experience. Another question we have, I think from past experience, is should I send my paper to an editing service before submitting?
Yeah, I addressed this a little bit before. I mean, a lot of people wonder if they should send it to an editing service, especially for language editing. And what I would say is it depends on what resources you have on hand. So if you have people around you that can look at and edit your paper and help you with language and structure and that sort of thing, then if you can get it to the stage where the article is the argument is understandable and the methods are clear, then I think that you can send it for peer review. Again, if it gets to the editor and they feel that the language is too difficult to send out to peer review, they'll just desk reject at that time. So that's a very quick process, the desk reject. They'll look at it and say, no, I can't send this out. And then you might choose to go with a language editing service. But if you don't have those resources at hand, then yes, I would recommend a language editing service.
Okay, sure. Thanks, Victoria. Once again, any other questions that anyone has, please type them in the chat box. We'll just give some time. If not, we will end the session.
And again, if you think of a question later, please feel free to contact me. I'm happy to have a chat via email.
Okay, I think there are no more questions at the moment. So I think as Victoria said, please do send in your questions. Feel free to get in touch with Victoria via email. She'll be happy to follow up with you. There will be a recording of this session sent out and a feedback form. Please do share your thoughts with us on this session so we can make future sessions better. And with that, I'd like to thank the librarian, Azura, for arranging this, working with us to arrange this session. Thank you and stay safe. You may log out now. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everyone.